listener production.
Hi, Sacha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. There's a crisis developing in China. Some of the country's cities are sinking. Beijing is among the cities sinking the fastest. In nearby Tianjin, thousands of people were evacuated from high-rise apartments last year when the streets suddenly split apart.
So we talk about climate change and the sea rising because the sea is higher, but if the land sinks, you have the same effect.
So why are China's cities sinking? And what can we learn here in Australia about future-proofing our own urban centres? That deep dive is coming up in the second half of this episode. But first, Bension Siebert is here with the headlines. It is Monday, the 6th of May.
Good morning, Sasha. The government of Israel has announced it will shut down a major media company in the country, Al Jazeera, claiming it's a mouthpiece for Hamas. The move is being condemned by press advocates.
Israel makes much of being a democracy, and I think the idea that it can simply close down an international broadcaster of considerable repute and history is atrocious. Sadly, it is part of a long set of actions that the Israeli government has taken to try and thwart free reporting of this conflict.
Tim Dawson from the International Federation of Journalists speaking on Al Jazeera there. Israeli police raided the broadcaster's office in Jerusalem overnight, although it's not known exactly when its broadcast into the country will be shut down. Al Jazeera called claims it was a threat to Israel's national security a dangerous and ridiculous lie, and warned the country's suppression of the free press stands in contravention of international and humanitarian law. Al Jazeera has the largest presence of any news organisation within Gaza, and it's documented human suffering there that has eroded international support for Israel's military operations. The broadcaster is owned by Qatar, the main country mediating talks between Hamas and Israel. Qatar set up Al Jazeera in the 1990s as a way to build influence around the Middle East. More than 140 Palestinian journalists, including Al Jazeera journalists, have been killed since the beginning of the war in Gaza.
Meantime, Hamas has claimed responsibility for an attack on a border crossing between Israel and Gaza. At least 10 were injured, some seriously, after the rocket strike on the Kerem Shalom crossing, one of the main points that aid is being delivered into Gaza. Hamas said it had been targeting Israeli soldiers in the area. In response, Israel has shut the border crossing, disrupting critical deliveries of food and supplies amid the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. And this is all happening as ceasefire talks continue in Cairo, but they look to have stalled. So the Israel delegation has urged Hamas to accept the deal, which would see an exchange of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners. But Israel has warned it will invade the southern city of Rafah anyway, despite any ceasefire deal. Now, the sticking point here is whether this ceasefire would see a permanent end to hostilities. Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected that demand, saying it'd allow Hamas to continue its operations in Gaza.
For decades, Australians studying teaching, nursing, midwifery and social work have been expected to complete work placements while at uni without any form of compensation for their time. It's a huge financial burden on thousands of people who struggle to find the time to work and study while completing their mandatory placements. From July next year, 73,000 students will receive a weekly $320 payment, which will be paid on top of any existing income support that they receive.
Yeah, Labor's clearly on the hunt for the youth vote with this budget, Bension. Yesterday, it announced it had wiped $3 billion off HECS and help debts. The government wants to reverse last year's mammoth indexation increase that saw thousands of dollars added to some student loans.
We're going to backdate this to last year. In other words, we're going to wipe out what happened last year and make sure that it never happens again.
That was Education Minister Jason Clare there. The government says it means that student debts won't outpace wage growth again by capping the indexation rate at either the Consumer Price Index or the Wage Price Index, whichever one is lower. Bension, I don't know about you, but I jumped on yesterday. There is a very helpful tool on the education website. It's called Help Estimator, and it tells you exactly how much you're going to get back, wiped off your HECS debt, I suppose. Did you have a look as well?
I sure did. And the question that I had about my own was I actually paid off my HECS debt finally late last year, and I wanted to know whether I was going to get any money back on my tax return or anything like that. And it looks like I will, but just a little bit.
Yeah, so if you paid it off last year when that if you were still paying your HECS last year when the indexation was applied, that's 7.1%, you'll actually get a tax credit. So anyone listening who was hit by that indexation increase but has since paid it off, you will get a little bit back in your tax, which is nice. About 3 million Aussies hold a student loan. The average debt's $26,500, and the measure is going to cut about $1,200 from the average HECS debt. It's interesting, this was in response to the Universities Accord, which looked into how our country deals with things like, university placements and HECS debts and all of that. Another recommendation was from this Universities Accord was for a payment for people doing mandatory placements, which is what we've gotten today from the Labor government. So Jason Clare did flag yesterday that the HECS measure wasn't going to be the last. I suppose it's good news for people who have a student loan and also for those people who do mandatory placements. However, some argue it doesn't go far enough. The Greens actually want the indexation process to be scrapped completely, and they want student debts wiped altogether. So some there saying it's not good enough.
And this is also a pretty big win for the independent MP, Monique Ryan, who's been pushing this petition, which I think got more than 200,000 signatures, saying that the HECS system needs to be changed. So a win for her also.
What are you looking at?
And Madonna has held a free concert in Rio de Janeiro on Copacabana Beach over the weekend. The event attracted around 1.6 million people to the beach, according to city officials, marking the end of her Celebration World Tour. There were also a reported 170 extra flights into the city as fans from around the world jumped at the chance to see the music icon. Security was also on high alert after a young Brazilian fan died at a Taylor Swift concert last year due to heat exhaustion. By all accounts, everyone was safe and had a great time.
I wanted to put this in perspective, right? Because you kind of hear a figure and you go, 1.6 mil, that's a lot. The biggest concert we've had in modern times in Australia was Ed Sheeran at the MCG, which had 109,000 people, and that was at the start of last year. I went to Taylor Swift's show in Sydney, and I think the crowd was in the high 70s or maybe early 80s. And it felt like everyone in the world was there when I was at the Taylor Swift gig. And that was not even, it wasn't even 10% of who turned out to see Madonna. That is an insane crowd. And the fact that she put it on for free, imagine how much money she would have made if she charged people entry for that show. Hotels in Copacabana reached a peak capacity of 98% for this event, and it was estimated by city officials that the concert actually injected $87 million Australian into the city's economy, which is pretty impressive. And it's also worth noting Madonna is 65 years old. That's not an easy concert for a 65-year-old to do, so good on Madge. Bension, thanks so much for being here for the headlines. We're going to change pace a bit now and talk about China's sinking cities. It's hard to picture an entire city sinking, but that's exactly what's happening in China. A new study has found 16% of the country's major cities are losing more than 10 millimetres of elevation a year, and nearly half are losing more than 3 mils per year. While those amounts might seem small, they do accumulate quickly. In 100 years, a quarter of China's urban coastal land could sit below sea level. Let's find out how and why and what's next. Robert Nicholls is a climate scientist and civil engineer at the University of East Anglia who reviewed the paper published this month in the journal Science. Robert, thanks for your time. Look, China's renowned for being pretty cagey about this kind of information. How was this data collated?
Well, the data, it uses a kind of global data set which is made from satellites. So the Sentinel-1 satellite orbits the Earth and it sends down a radar signal and looks at the return, and using the time, it measures the sort of distance to those objects, and then it repeats it. And so it sees, are the objects, and it's particularly things that reflect well, like roads, roofs. So things in cities are particularly good at providing returns. Are they going up or are they going down? And so over time, and the data in this report is based on 7 years of measurements, are you getting a trend of rising or falling? And so that's the basis. And you can really do this analysis anywhere. In this paper, they've done it in 82 cities in China.
Such interesting technology. I didn't even realise something like that was possible from a satellite. Look, before we get into specifically kind of what's happening in China, there's a word that came up a lot in this report. It's called subsidence. Can you explain to us what that is and how it relates to what's happening in China?
Well, subsidence really is literally the decline in land level, if you like. So what these satellites are measuring is the land stable? Is it going up? Or is it going down, losing elevation? And subsidence is the loss of elevation.
Okay, so this is what we are seeing in China, is this loss of elevation. And the study found that development and groundwater pumping are causing land subsidence. Is it a case in China of too much development and not enough oversight?
The reason, I think, you've got tremendous urbanization. The growth in cities in China, it has been tremendous over the last 30 years. Those people need to drink water, they need water. And so it's quite logical that they go for groundwater to satisfy that need. Pumping groundwater out then causes subsidence. So you see this all around the world where there's rapid development, I think. It's an issue of rapid development. You can be critical of oversight, but it's often after the fact that people seem to recognize this problem generically around the world. So I wouldn't be particularly critical of China.
Now, to me, right, my understanding of this sort of thing is very, very basic. And, you know, you look at development in China, so many buildings, so many people, so much infrastructure. Is there a case that it's just sheer weight on the ground that is causing this subsidence in China? Is that playing any sort of role?
I think that's a small factor, but the reason that the land sinks when you pump out water is that it's down to sort of certain geological settings, particularly deltas. So a city like Shanghai, which is China's biggest city in the coastal zone, is a kind of classic place where this has happened. You pump the groundwater out, the sediments, it gets a bit technical, I suppose, the sediments are slowly squeezing the water out over long time spans. When you pump it out, you remove it instantaneously and you increase the density of the material, but you also cause a drop in the level. Shanghai has gone down up to 3 meters since the early 20th century. Now, that's longer than these satellite measurements, but there have been some very big changes in some of these cities over long time spans.
What else is making these cities sink? We've already touched on a couple of ideas, but what else are we seeing having an impact?
Well, the pumping of groundwater, I think drainage. So that's another way of taking water out in the shallow sort of subsurface, particularly if you build on sort of marshy areas and you drain them, not necessarily for groundwater, just to be able to live there. If there's sort of marshy, soft soils, they will consolidate and subside. Parts of China, it's old mine workings, and the mines are, they've dug coal out, for example, and the surface is still responding to that. In land reclamations, they built a lot of new land out into the sea. You find that is sinking. But I would say, come back still, overall, although I said they didn't prove it, I would hypothesize, I guess, that groundwater extraction is the big one.
With the mining, you mentioned that was having some sort of impact, at least. In Australia, most of our mining takes place, as far as I'm aware, out in regional areas far away from big cities. Are they mining under cities in China?
I think in places, yes, or they have. And also maybe cities have expanded across areas that were mined in the past. It maybe they weren't cities there when they mined, but the cities have grown. So I'm not sure of the exact details, but and of course, China has a few more people than Australia.
Yeah, that's a big difference for them. Look, if it keeps going the way it's going, a quarter of China's urban coastal land could sit below sea level. What does that mean for those cities?
In the coastal areas, the impacts of this, I think, are very serious because falling land or subsidence means relative sea level rise. So we talk about climate change and the sea rising because the sea is higher, but if the land sinks, you have the same effect, and they'll add up. So that we have climate change causing the sea to rise, and then we have land level decline, which has the same effect, and they sum up. And in fact, these changes are often bigger than the changes in sea level we're seeing at the moment. So it really means these areas will all be flooded or completely submerged unless they either raise them by filling the surface of the land, I think that's probably unlikely, or more likely building dikes. But of course, China is a place where there are actually an awful lot of coastal defences, so they have been doing that historically.
What about underground infrastructure? So transport systems, underground garages or basements. What kind of impact could a sinking city have on its underground infrastructure?
It causes a lot of damage to infrastructure, building foundations. If subsidence is not uniform, uniform subsidence is less of a problem. If you get differential movement, then you get sort of shear, and so that causes buildings to fall over. So that's what's causing the damage. Also, with cities, you generally get more groundwater extraction when there's more people. So in the centres of cities, what you find is you get a depression cone, if you like. An area drops more than the area around it. So it creates a saucer or a bowl which floods very regularly with maybe from the sea, but inland from heavy rainfall. So there's quite a few adverse impacts, and I think it's generally recognised subsidence is not a good thing.
Look, the Netherlands is no stranger to subsidence. It's been dealing with it for decades. What have we learned from the Dutch and how they've addressed it?
They spend an awful lot of money actually trying to minimise subsidence. I suppose people always sort of think, why is the Netherlands below sea level? And, a lot of people think, it's climate change. Well, it's not. It's the land sunk. That's the key point. The Netherlands has been formed by land sinking, or that's one big process. Today, that continues. When they do building construction, for example, I mentioned that drainage will cause subsidence. They will try and keep the water table very high when they do building, which raises the costs, but you get much less subsidence from that. So if you like, they put a value on elevation and they try and sustain it. You might say you have an elevation capital. We talk about natural capital. Maybe this is one of the capitals that we undervalue.
Look, before we let you go, Robert, 87% of Australia's population lives within 50 k's of the coast. Could we learn a thing or two from what is happening in China? Should we be preparing for similar sort of things?
I'm not really aware that there's much problem with subsidence in Australia. So I would probably reassure you that this is not something that's probably going to translate. It may happen sort of locally in cities, but I don't think it'll happen anything like the scale that it's happening in China. I think that probably the big message is to take a holistic view of hazards. Maybe, Australia probably hasn't got this problem, but to look at what other kinds of issues might cause problems in Australia. Certainly the climate change and sea level rise will be a very big issue, and maybe the benefits of taking a strategic long-term view of responses. I think rather than react, maybe being a little bit proactive and then trying to anticipate these issues and be ready for them.
Another thing to add to the long list of things politicians have to think about. Robert, it's a fascinating chat. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That was Robert Nicholls, a climate scientist and civil engineer at the University of East Anglia, who's reviewed the paper published this month in the journal Science. And that is all for this morning's episode. We'll be back in your feed again this Savo from 3. But before you go, we would love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might get something out of it or enjoy it or just want to check us out. And if you do want to see our other content, we put up videos and full episodes of some of our interviews on YouTube. That's at Listener Newsroom. We're also on TikTok, and you can catch up with us at The Briefing Podcast on Instagram. I'm Sasha Barbagat. Thanks for listening.
Listener.